High Analyst Xylus of the Vraxian hegemony stared at the holographic transmission with all four of his primary optical sensors dilated in absolute horror. He was a member of a species so biologically delicate that a minor fracture or a sudden drop in blood pressure often resulted in immediate, irreversible systemic shock. To a Vraxian, the concept of physical struggle was a myth, a primitive relic of a pre-civilized past that their ancestors had evolved away from millions of cycles ago. On the screen before him, two groups of humans were engaged in what the Terran metadata labeled a championship rugby match. Xylus watched as a massive human carrying an oval object was tackled by three others, their bodies colliding with a sound that suggested the kinetic energy of a small shuttle crash. Bone hit turf, skin was abraded, and a dark, iron-rich fluid, human blood, stained the grass. "Explain this again," Xylus whispered to his tactical subprocessor, his voice trembling with the static of profound unease. "They are not being executed for crimes against the state? This is not a ritual suicide pact?" "Negative, High Analyst," the subprocessor responded, its tone clinical. "This is a recreational activity. They call it sport. The objective is to move the projectile to the opposing end of the field. The physical trauma is an incidental byproduct of the competition." Xylus watched as one of the humans stood up, spat a tooth onto the ground, and wiped blood from a gash over his eye. Instead of collapsing into the fatal shock that would have claimed any civilized species, the human grinned, showing too many teeth, and rejoined the fray. To Xylus, this was not evidence of strength. It was evidence of a species that lacked the most basic biological self-preservation instincts. The Vraxian hegemony had been monitoring Earth, a Class 12 death world, for several cycles. They had seen the reports of humans jumping from functional aircraft for recreation and ingesting chemical toxins for entertainment. Earth was a nightmare world where the gravity, the weather, and even the microbial life were designed to cause maximum trauma. The Vraxians had concluded that the humans were nothing more than meat puppets, primitives who had survived their hellish home through sheer dumb luck and an inability to perceive pain correctly. "They are broken," Xylus declared, turning away from the screen as another human was crushed into the dirt. A species that treats its own physical integrity with such casual disregard is a species that cannot possibly coordinate a defense. Their biology is a liability. They are apex predators born from a planet so hostile that merely existing there constitutes a military training exercise. Yet they lack the grace of true sentience. The High Council had reached the same conclusion. For 3 centuries, rumors of the terrifying Death Worlders had circulated through the trade routes, but the Vraxians saw no evidence of the monsters the stories described. They saw a species that apologized when their feet were stepped on and spent millions of years being hunted by things bigger and meaner than them. Xylus activated the interfleet comms. "Prepare the first liberation wave. The humans are fragile, disorganized, and clearly incapable of feeling the gravity of their own mortality. We will strike their industrial centers. Once they realize they can be broken, they will surrender within the first 100 million casualties." He did not know that he was making the same mistake countless others had made before him. He saw the table manners and the peaceful sports, but he failed to see the history of violence that humans had been practicing for far longer than they had been practicing diplomacy. He did not realize that on Earth, pain was not a signal to die, it was a signal to get angry. As the Vraxian fleet began its jump sequence toward the Sol system, the rugby match on the screen ended. The two teams, covered in blood and bruises, were shaking hands and laughing. Xylus missed the final frame. A human trainer stitching a deep wound on an athlete's arm without anesthesia, while the athlete calmly discussed the next game. The invasion had begun, and the hegemony was about to learn that humans didn't just survive on a death world, they owned it. The Vraxian vanguard did not arrive with fire. They arrived with what they believed was a merciful hand. To their optical sensors, humanity was a species that had clearly surrendered to its own fragile biology, living in small, scattered settlements on a planet that should have extinguished them long ago. Commander Krellis led the first strike team into a region known as Montana, landing near a solitary dwelling built of wood and stone. Standing in a nearby field was a single human, an older male named Elias, who was moving heavy earth with a primitive metal tool called a shovel. "Deployment initiated," Krellis signaled to High Analyst Xylus back on the command ship. "Target is isolated. We will use a standard disruption pulse. It should induce immediate neural shutdown and heart failure. Minimal mess, maximum compliance." For a Vraxian, a disruption pulse was a death sentence. The mere shock of the energy wave would shatter their delicate nervous system. Krellis raised his emitter and fired. The beam struck Elias directly in the shoulder, tearing through his fabric coverings and searing the flesh beneath. Krellis waited for the human to collapse. He waited for the systemic shock to stop the heart and still the lungs. But Elias did not fall. Instead, the human staggered back 2 paces, his free hand clutching the blackened wound on his shoulder. His face, previously weathered and calm, began to turn an alarming shade of deep red. He was not dying. He was experiencing a stage 3 transition. The calm had vanished, and his breathing became a series of long, slow draws through his nose. "Commander," the tactical officer whispered, his tentacles curling in confusion. "The biological readings are impossible. His heart rate has not stopped. It has tripled. His adrenal glands are flooding his system with a grade X combat stimulant." Elias looked at the smoking wound in his shoulder, then looked up at the Vraxian strike team. He did not scream for mercy. He did not beg for the Council's intervention. He simply gripped his shovel with both hands. A grip strength that Vraxian sensors noted was an evolutionary adaptation designed never to let go. "Now I'm actually getting annoyed," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shockwave of primal fear through the Vraxian ranks. Xylas, watching the feed from the bridge, felt his secondary heart stutter. "Krellis, abort! Use maximum yield. He is moving." But it was too late. The fragile human, shot through the shoulder with a pulse that could glass a Vraxian, did not run away. He charged. He moved with a persistent, terrifying grace that suggested his body did not care about the seared nerve endings or the blood loss. The primitive shovel was no longer a tool. It was a weapon of creative violence, and Elias was swinging it with the focused intent of an apex predator that had been hunted for millions of years and was finally done with the games. The last thing Xylas saw before the feed from Krellis' helmet camera went dark was the shovel blade descending and the sound of Vraxian carapace shattering like thin glass. "High Analyst," the subprocessor chirped, its voice now frantic. "The human has neutralized the entire strike team. He is currently performing field surgery on himself using a heated blade and a bottle of high-proof alcohol." Xylas stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process the reality that a human could survive what should be a terminal event. "They aren't meat puppets," he breathed, his scales turning a deathly pale white. "They are something else. What happens when the rest of them find out we've arrived?" As if in answer, a massive energy signature spiked from the nearby town. The humans weren't retreating to bunkers. They were arming themselves with everything from hunting rifles to heavy industrial equipment. The Vraxian hegemony had come to liberate a fragile species, but as the first human resistance cells began to blink onto the tactical map, Xylas realized they had accidentally kicked the door to a cage they were never meant to open. Back in the command center, a new transmission appeared on the main screen. Not from a Vraxian officer, but from the human farmer himself, holding Krellis' severed communicator. His eyes were cold, and he looked directly into the camera. "You missed," Elias said, "and you don't get a second shot." High Analyst Xylas stood paralyzed as the tactical subprocessor updated the casualty list from the Montana incursion. 12 elite operatives gone. He realized that the Vraxian hegemony had fundamentally misunderstood the biological architecture of the human species. To a Vraxian, physical trauma was a terminal event. To a human, it appeared to be a catalyst for a terrifying biological transition. "Send the Shadow Stalkers," Xylas ordered, his voice thin and brittle. "Target the military outpost at Grid Alpha. If a farmer can resist, we must see how their trained soldiers react to concentrated fire." The target was Sergeant Sarah Miller, currently on solo patrol near a communications relay. The Shadow Stalkers, specialized in surgical elimination, did not use disruption pulses. They used hypervelocity flechette rounds designed to pierce armor and liquefy internal organs. From the safety of the command ship, Xylas watched the thermal feed. 3 flechettes struck Miller. 1 in the thigh, 2 in the torso. By any civilized metric, she was dead. Her internal temperature should have plummeted, and her neural activity should have ceased instantly. "Status?" Xylas demanded. "Sensors are malfunctioning," the subprocessor reported, its voice spiking with electronic static. "Her heart rate has reached 190 beats per minute. Her pupils have dilated to the point of total light absorption. Her body is diverting all non-essential blood flow to the skeletal muscles." Miller did not fall. She didn't even scream. Instead, she reached down, gripped the flechette protruding from her thigh, and ripped it out with a snarl of creative violence that made Xylus's optical sensors dim in sympathetic shock. "What is happening?" Xylus whispered. "She has entered a state of adrenaline dump," the subprocessor replied. "It is a biological survival mechanism from their nightmare world. It suppresses pain receptors, increases reaction time by 40%, and grants her unreasonable physical strength." The Shadow Stalkers moved to finish her, but the creature that was Sarah Miller was no longer the bipedal primate they had studied in the orientation videos. She moved with a persistent and utterly unreasonable speed. She vaulted a 2-meter barricade with a shattered leg and drove a combat knife through the neck seal of the lead stalker. She wasn't fighting like a soldier. She was fighting like an apex predator that had spent millions of years being hunted by things bigger, faster, and meaner than her. Every time a stalker landed a blow that should have been incapacitating, Miller simply absorbed the impact and retaliated with a ferocity that suggested her biology was no longer bound by the laws of self-preservation. "She is a meat terminator," Xylus breathed, watching his most expensive killers being dismantled by a woman who should have been a corpse 3 minutes ago. The last Shadow Stalker attempted to flee, but Miller, blood-soaked and ignoring a punctured lung, chased him down with the terrifying persistence of a species that had evolved on a world that actively tried to kill them every single day. When the field went silent, Miller stood over the wreckage of the elite squad. She didn't seek medical attention. She looked directly into the concealed Vraxian sensor drone and spat blood. "Hi, Analyst," the subprocessor chirped. "She has recovered a Vraxian datapad. She is uploading a message to our core frequency." The screen flickered, and Miller's face appeared, illuminated by the fires of the outpost. She looked tired, but her eyes held a cold certainty that made Xylus realize the stories hadn't been myths. They had been warnings. "You think we're easy to kill because we're soft," she said, her voice a low rasp. "But on Earth, pain is just the thing that tells us we're still winning. And you just made us very, very focused." Xylus collapsed into his command chair as he realized the truth. They weren't fighting a military, they were fighting a biological imperative that refused to acknowledge the concept of defeat. "We need to see their medical files," Xylus ordered frantically. "I need to know how they survived these wounds. I need to know what they call anesthesia." The Varaxian scientific vessel, excellence of thought, hummed with the frantic activity of 1,000 subprocessors as Chief Biologist Volin reviewed the biological data harvested from the Montana and Grid Alpha skirmishes. High Analyst Xylus stood behind him, his optical sensors twitching with a nervous static that suggested his own systemic shock was only cycles away. "Explain the meat terminator phenomenon," Xylus commanded, his voice brittle. "How does a bipedal primate with no exoskeleton and underdeveloped neck muscles survive a hypervelocity flechette to the torso?" Volin projected a massive 3-dimensional rendering of a human DNA strand, which appeared to be pulsing with a stubborn refusal to die. "High Analyst, we have reached a terrifying conclusion. Humans are not merely inhabitants of a Class 12 death world, they are its ultimate biological refinement." He highlighted a series of chemical glands within the human model. "This is the source of the adrenaline dump we observed. It is a natural, high-potency combat drug produced internally by the human body during periods of existential crisis." Volin paused, his mandibles clicking in a rhythm of profound unease. In any other species, this level of chemical stimulation would result in immediate cardiac rupture. In humans, it grants unreasonable physical strength and a temporary immunity to pain that defies every fundamental law of Vraxian medicine. "There is more," Volin continued, his chromatophores shifting to a pale white of total shock. "We analyzed their dietary habits. Humans regularly ingest things that would kill most known species. High-concentration capsaicin for sport and literal poison, which they call alcohol for entertainment. Their biology is so accustomed to toxic environments that their immune systems treat a battlefield injury as a minor inconvenience rather than a terminal event." Xylus watched a video file retrieved from a human medical database. It showed a surgery, a process where human medical officers used metal blades to cut open a conscious patient to repair internal damage. "They cut themselves open?" Xylus whispered, his feeding tentacles going rigid with horror. "Willingly," Volin confirmed. "They call it life-saving." To them, the act of being physically unmade and stitched back together is a routine procedure. They have table manners and polite diplomatic smiles, but it is all a mask for a species that has been practicing violence and survival for millions of years longer than they have been practicing diplomacy. They are apex predators who chose to become diplomats because the alternative was their own extinction, Volan concluded, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. They are not broken primitives. They are a species that has learned to channel their terrifying biological imperative into a calculated, cold-blooded policy of persistence. Xylus stared at the report, realizing that the Vraxian fleet was not invading a planet. They were stepping onto a Class 12 death world populated by 8 billion organisms that viewed lethal trauma as a learning opportunity. "High Analyst," the tactical officer suddenly barked. "New sensor data is emerging from the human polar regions. Massive energy signatures. They don't match human technology. They're biological." Xylus leaned forward, his mind refusing to process the incoming data. "What are they?" "I don't know, sir," the officer replied, his voice cracking with panic. "But the humans aren't the only things living on that planet. And it looks like they've just decided to open the cages." High Analyst Xylus of the Vraxian hegemony stood on the command deck, his feeding tentacles limp with exhaustion as he stared at the latest intercepted transmission from a human medical center. The Vraxians had been monitoring Earth for cycles, yet they continued to be blindsided by the sheer biological absurdity of the human species. To a Vraxian, whose redundant organ systems were designed to fail upon the slightest psychological shock of injury, what appeared on the screen was nothing short of existential dread. The holographic display showed a human surgical theater where several medical officers were gathered around a restrained, unconscious patient. Xylus watched, his 4 optical sensors dilated in absolute horror, as a human in green garments took a metal blade and began to willingly slice through the chest of another living being. The Vraxians expected the disruption pulse of such trauma to cause immediate neural shutdown and heart failure, as it would in any civilized species. Instead, they watched in a stunned, vibrating silence as the human's internal organs were exposed to the open air. With a surgical precision that defied every fundamental law of Vraxian medicine, the humans manipulated the living heart. The patient did not die. Their biology simply adapted to the intrusion, kept stable by machines and the inherent stubbornness of a species forged on a Class 12 death world. Xylus realized that a species that could willingly endure being unmade and stitched back together for the sake of survival would never be truly terrified by Vraxian threats. To humans, the atmosphere, the gravity, and the very microbes of their homeworld were constant nightmares. Yet they remained the apex predator of that nightmare world. "They are monsters that other monsters made deals with," Xylus whispered, his voice crackling with the static of profound disbelief. He realized that the Vraxian hegemony had mistaken human table manners and diplomatic smiles for biological fragility. The humans were not broken primitives. They were a species that had learned to control their terrifying biological imperatives through centuries of practice. The tactical subprocessor suddenly interrupted, its chromatophores shifting to a pale white of total systemic alarm. The Terran Defense Coalition Priority Alpha had just entered the sector. Xylus looked at the sensor grid and saw that it was not just a fleet of warships. The energy signatures appearing from slipspace did not match any known human technology. Massive entities, some spanning kilometers in length, emerged from the void with a terrible iridescent grace. The humans had stopped playing nice. They had opened the cages of the locked-away nightmares they had forged in the crucibles of their own violent history. Admiral Marcus Webb appeared on the emergency channels, his face no longer holding the patient amusement of a diplomat. He looked directly into the Vraxian sensors with a cold certainty that made the temperature on the command deck seem to drop. "You mistook our preference for peace as an inability to wage war," Webb stated, his voice a low vibration of impending violence. "We've been practicing violence for far longer than we've been practicing diplomacy, and you have finally forced us to stop being patient." The Vraxian planetary defense networks began to collapse entirely before a single shot was even fired. Xylus realized with a sinking heart that the humans hadn't come to negotiate or bargain. They had come to provide a demonstration of what happens when a species from a death world finally runs out of patience. "Admiral," Xylus stammered into the comms, "there has been a terrible misunderstanding." "No," Webb replied, his eyes reflecting the dying light of the Vraxian vanguard. "This is consequences." High Analyst Xylus watched the tactical display as the human fleet, led by the massive flagship Relentless, moved into a perfect blockade formation around the Vraxian homeworld. The subprocessor's voice had dropped to a mechanical whimper, reporting that the humans had not even armed their primary planet crackers or orbital bombardment platforms yet. They didn't need to. The data from the surface skirmishes had already spread through the hegemony like a contagion. To stop a human, one had to achieve complete and overwhelming victory through total vaporization or conversion into constituent atoms. Anything less only served to activate their terrifying biological imperative, a state of being where pain was merely information used to fuel further violence. Hi, Analyst. The subprocessor chirped, its light pulsing a frantic red. The human high command has transmitted a final document. It is not a list of demands. It is a performance review of our invasion. Xylus read the scrolling text with a numb sense of existential dread. The humans had graded the Vraxian fleet's formation discipline and tactical flexibility, ultimately ranking the hegemony's finest warriors as last on a leaderboard behind several human trainee squadrons. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Vraxians had been fighting what Admiral Webb casually referred to as the Rookies. The varsity team was still waiting in the cold black of the Outer Reach, and their arrival would mean nothing less than total extermination. The Vraxian High Council, usually so smug and patronizing, was now a gathering of terrified beings. They had seen the footage of the Montana farmer and Sergeant Miller. They finally understood that when you threaten their young, they don't negotiate. They had accidentally kidnapped the peace of the galaxy and replaced it with a tactical screaming campaign of human fury. Issue the unconditional surrender immediately, Xylus ordered, his feeding tentacles limp as he collapsed into his command throne. Open all channels. Tell them we accept every term. Tell them we will pay any reparations for the casualties we caused. The human response was immediate and terrifying in its calm. Admiral Webb appeared on the main screen, once again sipping coffee with a pleasant, almost friendly expression that no longer fooled anyone. He was the face of an apex predator that just happened to have table manners. Wise choice, Webb said, his voice smooth and calm. We genuinely prefer peace. We've learned from our mistakes over thousands of years of practicing violence, and we really hope the rest of the galaxy could learn from our example instead of forcing us to teach the lesson the hard way. As the Vraxian fleet began to power down their weapons and withdraw to neutral territory, Xylus looked out at the stars. He realized that the galaxy had fundamentally misunderstood what humans actually are. They weren't just diplomats who were soft or weak. They were predators who chose to become diplomats because they knew exactly what happened when they weren't. The annoyance protocol was now the new galactic standard. Every species, from the mighty Krell to the crystalline Valdrines, had watched the hegemony fall in less than half a day. They would all remember the cardinal rule of warfare that Xylus had learned too late. Never mistake kindness for weakness. Xylus whispered to the empty bridge, because eventually even the most patient species runs out of patience. And when that species comes from Earth, you really don't want to be around when it happens. Outside, the human titans and dragons began to fade back into the cold black, patient and calculating, waiting for the next time someone was stupid enough to resist. The myth had become reality, and for the Vraxian hegemony, reality was a very quiet, very long conversation about how this happened. High Analyst Xylus stood on the observation deck of Transition Point Delta 7, a human military installation that radiated the same controlled danger he had now come to associate with everything Terran. Following the Vraxian hegemony's surrender, they had been integrated into a series of cooperation protocols. Their finest surviving pilots were now serving as training opposition for the Terran Defense Coalition. Xylus watched through reinforced armor glass as a human squad known as Apex Elite prepared for a live-fire simulation. He turned toward Admiral Marcus Webb, who was still sipping coffee with that infuriating smile Xylus had learned to associate with impending catastrophe. "You said we fought your rookies," Xylus said, his voice a tremor of exhausted certainty. "But these individuals, they do not look different. They are the same meat puppets we saw in Montana." Webb set his mug down, and his expression shifted into something ancient and predatory. "Appearance is humanity's favorite tactical advantage," Webb replied. "The squad you're watching doesn't just produce adrenaline. They've been practicing violence since before your people even discovered fire. They don't just survive trauma, they thrive in it. On the field below, an elite soldier was struck by a high-output simulated kinetic blast. To a Vraxian, the disruption pulse from the impact should have caused immediate systemic shutdown. Instead, the soldier used the momentum to roll into a textbook flanking maneuver, rising with a creative violence that dismantled the automated drone targets in seconds. Xylas realized that the annihilation they had narrowly avoided was not a matter of weaponry, but of a biological stubbornness that refused to acknowledge physical limits. Your recruits were polite because they were still learning their table manners. Webb continued casually. The Apex team has already finished being patient. They're the reason we keep our military separate from our diplomatic summits. Because when they show up, it's no longer for talking. Xylas watched the human soldier below. The man should have been clutching his head after a collision that would have shattered a Vraxian's carapace, but he didn't stop. He kept moving, his heart rate and energy signatures spiking to levels that proved the absence of evidence regarding their true power was never evidence of absence. The hegemony had been playing with fire and stone, never realizing they were merely a case study in creative dismantling for the human elite. What is the next lesson? Xylas asked quietly. Webb leaned in, his eyes hardening into something that looked like compressed neutronium. The lesson is respect through strength, Webb whispered. Because tomorrow, we're taking your commanders into a simulation of a formal military engagement. And this time, we aren't using training rounds. Xylas felt his primary heart stutter. The war was over, but the nightmare of truly understanding humanity was only just beginning. The formal military engagement simulation was held in the vacuum-sealed lunar arena of Tycho Crater. High Analyst Xylas stood alongside the remaining Vraxian High Command, their breathing apparatuses hissing in the silence of the observation deck. Below them, 100 human Apex elite soldiers stood in an open plain, facing 1,000 Vraxian Mark IV autonomous enforcers, machines designed to calculate and exploit the biological weaknesses of any known species. This is the cold math your species so frequently mentions? General Vore asked, his mandibles twitching as the countdown began. 10-to-1 odds against superior mechanical intelligence. By every metric, your soldiers should surrender before the first kinetic discharge. Admiral Webb, standing at the back of the room with a datapad, didn't look up. Metrics don't account for the Death Worlder spite, he said calmly. Watch. The simulation went live. The Vraxian machines opened fire with hypervelocity needles and disruption beams. In the first 10 seconds, 3 human soldiers were hit. One was struck in the side by a beam that would have instantly paralyzed a Vraxian's primary neural cluster. To the horror of the observers, the human didn't fall. He used the searing heat of the wound to cauterize the bleeding against a piece of heated cover and returned fire with a heavy rail rifle. His internal sensors should be screaming for a shutdown, Vore hissed, his optical sensors dilated in disbelief. The trauma levels are terminal. He's not listening to his sensors, Webb replied. He's listening to his training. On Earth, we have a saying, if it's still attached, it still works. The battle became a display of unreasonable persistence. The humans moved with a terrifying synchronization, ignoring wounds that should have induced immediate shock. They didn't fight like a traditional military, they fought like a single multi-headed organism that viewed physical damage as a mere logistical hurdle. When a human soldier was finally neutralized by a direct explosive hit, the others didn't retreat. They became colder, their efficiency increasing as the adrenaline dump reached its peak. By the end of the hour, the 1,000 Vraxian machines were piles of smoldering scrap. The humans stood in the center of the arena, bloodied, bruised, and breathing heavily, but undeniably victorious. They are not meat terminators, Xylas whispered, the realization finally sinking into his core. Terminators are programmed. These creatures choose to be this way. They choose to ignore the fundamental reality of pain. That's the final lesson, Xylas, Webb said, finally stepping forward. We aren't dangerous because we're strong. We're dangerous because we're the only species in the galaxy that feels the full weight of our mortality and decides to fight anyway. We cry for our dead, we mourn our victories, and we regret every shot we're forced to fire. Xylas looked at the human soldiers below. They were now tending to each other's wounds, their movements mechanical and tired. He saw a soldier weeping silently while he wrapped a comrade's shattered arm. It was the most terrifying thing Xylas had ever seen. A species that regrets its own violence, Xylus recorded in the final entry of the Vraxian war logs, is a species that will never stop until the job is done. They don't fight for glory or territory. They fight so they can stop fighting, and that is why the hegemony fell. We were fighting for an empire. They were fighting to go home. The simulation ended, and the lights of the arena dimmed. The Meat Terminator myth had been replaced by a much darker reality. The galaxy had been warned. Humanity was the patient predator, the species that would endure any trauma, cross any distance, and sacrifice anything to ensure their survival. As the Vraxian delegation prepared to leave, Xylus turned back to the Admiral. "Will you ever stop being patient, Admiral?" Webb smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "I hope we never have to find out,"